The phone rang at 2:47 in the afternoon, and by 2:48, my whole life had folded in on itself like paper. "Mrs. Carleen Whitfield?" the voice asked. "This is County General. You need to come down here. It's about your husband." My name is Carleen. I'd been married to Theodore for 11 years, and in all that time, the warehouse never called me. Not once. Theodore handled his own business. He didn't need rescuing. So when that voice said, "Come down here," my hands started shaking before my mind caught up to why. I didn't ask what happened. I already knew, somewhere beneath my ribs, that whatever it was bad enough that they couldn't say it over the phone. If you're watching this on your lunch break, in bed, or folding laundry like I was when my phone rang, stay with me. Because what happened next changed everything I thought I understood about my husband, his job, and the man he worked for. I grabbed my purse, left the laundry in the basket, and drove faster than I had any business driving. The whole way, I kept telling myself it was a sprain, a cut needing stitches, something small enough to laugh about later. It wasn't small. The emergency room doors opened to a wall of quiet that hit harder than any noise could have. A nurse met me almost immediately, and a man in a security guard's jacket, Tatum Logistics stitched across the chest, stood several feet away near the entrance, speaking quietly with someone from the hospital. "Where's my husband?" I said. "Where's Theodore?" The nurse touched my arm instead of answering, and that touch told me before her mouth ever opened. "I'm so sorry, ma'am. He didn't make it." The room tilted. I heard myself ask how, and the words came back soft and careful. Workplace accident, equipment malfunction. The injuries were too severe. She explained what she knew, then admitted the hospital had only received the information provided by emergency responders and the employer. "I want to know what happened," I said. "What equipment? What part of the warehouse? Who was with him?" "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Those details are usually handled by the employer and the investigating agencies. We don't always receive the full incident report." A staff member nearby glanced toward the Tatum Logistics security guard before lowering his voice, and someone gathered a few papers from the nurse's station as another employee reminded them they were needed elsewhere. None of it meant anything by itself, but in that moment, every sideways glance felt heavier than it should have. Eldridge Tatum himself wasn't there. His warehouse, his employee, his accident, and the owner of all three couldn't be bothered to show his face. I noted that. I didn't know yet why I was noting it. I just knew grief doesn't usually come with this many unanswered questions. I asked to see him. They let me, finally. And I stood over my husband's body, trying to memorize a face that didn't look like rest. It looked like something had been taken from him before he was ready to give it. On my way out, half blind with crying, I passed a young man in a Tatum Logistics vest, sitting alone on a bench outside the ER, his hands pressed flat against his knees like he was holding himself together. "Were you there?" I asked him. "Were you with Theodore when it happened?" He looked up at me, and for 1 second, something passed across his face. Not grief, fear. Then he looked away, down at the floor, anywhere but at me, and said nothing at all. 3 days after the funeral, the report came in a thin manila envelope, like Theodore's death only needed 2 pages to explain. I sat at the kitchen table and read it twice before I let myself feel anything. Equipment malfunction, forklift failure, no witnesses present at time of incident. No witnesses. In a warehouse with 40 employees on shift. I thought about the young man on the bench outside the ER, the one who couldn't look at me. He'd been wearing a Tatum Logistics vest. If there were truly no witnesses, why did a grown man sit there with his hands shaking like he'd seen something he couldn't unsee? I read it a third time, slower, And that's when the holes started showing themselves. The report listed the time of the incident as 1:15 in the afternoon, but the hospital called me at 2:47, over an hour later. An hour for a man to be found, assessed, and transported in a building Theodore had worked in for 6 years and could navigate blind. Something about that hour sat wrong in my stomach. I called the warehouse office, kept my voice steady, asked for whoever filed the report. A woman named Denise answered, friendly at first, until I asked my actual question, why the timeline didn't match, and her friendliness went thin and careful. Mrs. Whitfield, I really can't speak to the details. You'd have to take that up with corporate. I'm not asking corporate, I'm asking you. You typed the report. A pause. Then, I just enter what I'm given, ma'am. I don't decide what goes in it. What I'm given. Not what I witnessed. Not what I confirmed. What she was given by somebody. I hung up and sat with that a long moment, my grief curling into something sharper, something with edges. Theodore was careful. Meticulous, even. He checked his mirrors twice before backing out of our driveway. A man like that doesn't get caught by a forklift he'd operated 1,000 times. In a warehouse, he could walk in the dark. I needed something of his. Something that wasn't this sanitized 2-page lie. I went to his home office, the one room I'd always treated as his workspace. Unless he asked me to grab a file or straighten up while he was traveling, I rarely opened his desk drawers. They'd always been his domain, and I'd never had a reason to think otherwise. Most of it was ordinary, old pay stubs, a broken stapler, a coffee mug he never washed properly. But the bottom drawer didn't open. I tugged it twice, then noticed something I was certain hadn't always been there. A small brass lock, the kind you'd buy at any hardware store, neatly fitted into the drawer. Theodore never locked anything from me. Not his phone, not his email, not a single drawer in this house. If he'd added that lock, he'd done it recently. And for a reason I was only now beginning to wonder about. I found the spare key taped beneath the drawer above it, where he probably thought I'd never look. My fingers were trembling when I turned it. Inside wasn't pay stubs or paperwork. It was a journal. Black leather, worn soft at the corners like he'd carried it, opened it, closed it again more times than I could count. And I had never once seen it in my life. I sat on the floor of his office, back against the desk, and opened the first page with hands that didn't feel like mine anymore. The earliest entries were ordinary: work stress, a difficult shipment, a headache that wouldn't quit. Theodore's handwriting, small and slanted, the same hand that used to leave notes on the bathroom mirror. I almost smiled, reading them, like some part of me thought this would stay harmless. Then the entries changed. Eldridge stopped by the house again today. Said he was in the neighborhood. We live 40 minutes from the warehouse. There is no reason for him to be in this neighborhood. I read it twice. Eldridge had never once mentioned coming by our house. Not to me, not in passing, not at the company holiday party where he'd shaken my hand and called me Theodore's better half, with a smile that I'd thought was just polite. I kept reading. He asked me today if Carlene still had the necklace he sent for her birthday last year. I told him I didn't know what he was talking about. Because I didn't. Because she never got a necklace from him. My stomach dropped clean through the floor. I had gotten a necklace last year. Small, gold, left on our porch in a gift box with no card. My sister had a habit of dropping off birthday presents without making a fuss. So I'd thanked her later, and she'd laughed and said, "If you say so." I never questioned it. I'd worn the necklace twice before deciding it wasn't really my style and putting it away. Theodore had known. Or he'd found out. And he never said a word to me about it. The entries kept going, each one colder than the last. Eldridge running into me at the grocery store on the same day Theodore mentioned where I'd be going. Eldridge asking Theodore, almost playfully, whether Carlene ever got lonely with him working such long hours. Eldridge offering Theodore a raise that came with strings Theodore didn't write down, but clearly understood. Late nights, weekend shifts, time away from this house, from me. He's not subtle anymore, one entry read. I think he's testing how far I'll let this go before I say something. I haven't told Carlene any of this. I don't want her looking over her shoulder because of a man's ego. My throat tightened. He'd been protecting me from this, carrying it alone, writing it down instead of speaking it out loud, maybe because he didn't want to scare me, or maybe because he didn't fully believe it himself until it was too late to believe anything else. The handwriting changed in the final entries, tighter, faster, like he was running out of time to get the words down. Eldridge mentioned the warehouse audit today, said it almost like a warning, like he wanted me to know he could move things around if he needed to. People, numbers, whatever he needed, moved. And then, 2 days before the call that ended my world, the last entry, shorter than all the rest. No explanation, no context, like he'd written it in a hurry and never came back to finish the thought. I think he knows I know. I stared at those 6 words until they blurred, until I couldn't tell if the shaking was grief or something colder settling into the bone. Theodore hadn't died in an accident. Theodore had been afraid. I called Marquis before I called anyone else because if anyone deserved to know the truth about his father, it was my son. He came by that evening with his wife, Denise. No, not Denise. I'm sorry. With his wife trailing behind him. And I sat them both down at the same kitchen table where I'd read that report 3 days earlier. I showed him the journal. I watched his face as he read his father's handwriting, waiting for the same cold drop I'd felt. It never came. "Mama," he said, closing the journal gently like it was something fragile instead of something true. "Daddy worked 12-hour shifts. People get paranoid when they're tired. This doesn't mean anything happened." He wrote that Eldridge knew he knew something. Knew what, though? He never says. "Mama, you just lost your husband. Your mind is looking for somewhere to put all that pain. And right now, it's landed on a story that makes more sense than accidents happen." I felt something close off in my chest, a door I hadn't known was still open. "So, you think I'm making this up? I think you're grieving. I think there's a difference." I wanted to throw the journal at him. Instead, I sat very still and asked him the one thing I needed an honest answer to. "Have you ever known your father to write something down that wasn't true?" Marquise didn't answer that. He looked at his wife instead, like he needed permission to feel anything other than certain, and that silence told me more than his words had. By the time people started arriving for the gathering after the service, family, neighbors, a few of Theodore's co-workers who actually showed their faces this time, I'd already learned not to bring up the journal again. I watched Marquis move through the house, accepting condolences, playing the steady sun, while I stood near the kitchen feeling like a stranger at my own husband's farewell. An aunt of Theodore's patted my hand and said something about God's timing. A co-worker mentioned how well-liked Theodore was, how shocked everyone still was. I nodded along to all of it, smiling the way you smile when your face has learned the shape without your heart agreeing to it. Then the room shifted. I felt it before I saw it. The way conversations dipped lower, the way a few heads turned toward the front door. Eldridge Tatum stood in the doorway in a dark gray suit, holding a bouquet of white lilies like he'd rehearsed the gesture in a mirror. "Carlene." He said my name softly, almost intimately, crossing the room before I could decide whether I wanted him to. He handed me the lilies, then rested his hand lightly against my forearm for a brief moment. just long enough to feel more familiar than comfort required. I am so sorry for your loss. Theodore was more than an employee to me. He was family. I thought about the journal. He's not subtle anymore. That's kind of you to say, I said, taking a small step back as I accepted the flowers, careful not to make a scene. Eldridge held my gaze a moment longer than grief required, warmth in his expression that had nothing to do with sympathy. It wasn't enough for anyone else in the room to question, but I questioned it. And behind him, Marquis watched the whole exchange with an expression I couldn't read at all. I drove to the county police station the morning after the repast, the journal sitting on my passenger seat like it might lose its courage if I left it home. Detective Roy Pickens met me in a small room that smelled like burnt coffee, his tie loosened like he'd already decided this conversation wasn't worth the formality of looking sharp. I laid the journal on the table between us and walked him through it. The strange visits, the necklace, the audit comment, the final line that still made my hands cold every time I read it. He flipped through maybe 4 pages before closing it. Mrs. Whitfield, I understand you're going through something terrible right now. I'm not going through grief confusion, Detective. I'm telling you my husband wrote that a man knew he knew something 2 days before he died in that man's warehouse. Knew what, though? Pickens leaned back, and I heard an echo of Marquise in his voice that made my jaw tighten. There's no specifics here, no names beyond Eldridge, who, by the way, has been fully cooperative with our investigation. Your investigation took less than 4 days. Because the evidence supported an accidental death. Equipment malfunction, confirmed by the safety inspector. I understand you want there to be more to this. People do, when the loss doesn't make sense to them. But wanting it doesn't make it true. There were no witnesses listed? 40 employees on shift and not one person saw anything? Warehouses are big buildings, ma'am. People work in sections. I felt the conversation closing around me the way the kitchen table conversation with Marquis had closed, politely, firmly, like a door someone was easing shut, so I wouldn't notice my fingers were still in the frame. Can you at least reopen it? Just look again? The case is closed, Mrs. Whitfield. I'm sorry for your loss, truly, but I can't reopen something based on a man's private journal entries that don't actually allege anything provable. I left that room with the journal back in my bag and a hollowness in my chest that felt heavier than the grief had, because grief at least came with people telling me they understood. This was different. This was being told, gently, that I was wrong about the one thing I was certain of. I'd made it halfway down the hallway toward the exit when I realized I'd left my scarf in the waiting area. I turned back, and that's when I heard Pickens's voice through his half-open office door, lower than before, speaking on the phone. She came in with a journal. No, nothing I'd consider actionable. I stopped without meaning to. Yes, she's still convinced there's more to it. A pause. No, the case hasn't changed. Another pause. I've already spoken with the company's attorney. If they reach out again, tell them the file is still closed and there's nothing new to address. He listened for a moment before answering. I don't expect this to go any further. Even her family thinks she's struggling to let it go. A quiet chuckle followed. All right. Keep me posted if anyone contacts you. The line disconnected. I stood frozen in the hallway, my scarf forgotten in the waiting room behind me. Maybe there was an innocent explanation for what I'd just heard. Maybe there wasn't. Police departments spoke with company lawyers after workplace fatalities. I knew that much. But something about the ease in his voice, the familiarity of the conversation, and the certainty that nothing would ever be looked at again settled hard inside me. Whether he'd crossed a legal line or simply decided too quickly that Theodore's death wasn't worth another look, one thing had become painfully clear. Someone connected to Tatum Logistics already knew exactly where Detective Pickens stood. And somewhere inside that calm, practiced conversation, I heard just how far Eldridge Tatum's influence might extend. Eldridge showed up at my door on a Tuesday, unannounced, holding a casserole dish like he'd suddenly become the kind of man who cooked. "My housekeeper made it," he admitted, almost sheepish, when I looked at him too long. "I didn't want you to think I was trying too hard." I let him in because the alternative, slamming the door on the one man who might actually know what happened to Theodore, felt like throwing away the only thread I had. He sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Marquis had told me I was grieving wrong, and Eldridge looked entirely too comfortable in a chair that wasn't his. "I worry about you," he said, after the small talk ran dry. "Financially, I mean. Theodore's life insurance, his pension. These things take months to process. And I know bills don't wait for paperwork. We're managing. I'd like to help. Quietly. No strings, Carlene, I promise you that." He said my name the way he had at the repast. Too soft. Too familiar, like he'd already decided we were further along than we were. "That's generous," I said, giving him nothing else to hold on to. He reached across the table then and rested his hand over mine before I could pull it back, his thumb brushing my knuckles in a way that made my skin crawl quiet and deep. Theodore was a good man, but good men don't always provide the way a woman deserves. I could have given you both so much more if things had been different. I slid my hand back slowly, careful not to make it look like the flinch it was. "Eldridge, I think it's too soon for me to hear something like that." Of course. He smiled like a man who'd planted a seed and was content to wait for it to grow on its own schedule. "I'm not going anywhere, Carlene. I just want you to know you're not alone in this." After he left, I stood at the window and watched his car pull out of my driveway, my stomach twisted tight with something between disgust and disbelief. 3 weeks. My husband had been dead 3 weeks, and this man was already measuring the space Theodore left behind, deciding how much of it he intended to fill. I thought about slamming every door I had left, refusing his calls, returning whatever he sent, making it clear exactly what kind of woman he was dealing with. It would have felt good. It would have felt honest. But Pickens had shut the case. Marquis had shut his ears. The only person left who moved in Eldridge's world, who had access to whatever he was hiding, who might one day get careless enough to say too much, was Eldridge himself. If I pushed him away now, completely, the way every part of me wanted to, I'd be slamming the only door that led anywhere near the truth. And he would simply find someone else to be warm to, somewhere else to spend his attention, while whatever happened to Theodore stayed buried exactly where Pickens had promised it would. I hated what that meant. I hated it, and I understood it at the same time. And standing there at that window, I felt something in me go quiet, and still, in a way, grief never had. Eldridge called 4 days later, his voice light, like Tuesday's visit had been nothing more than neighborly kindness. "There's a dinner Friday. Small thing. A few business associates. I'd like you there, Carlene, as my guest." I stood in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, looking at the chair he'd sat in, and I felt something inside me shift into a different gear entirely. "I'd like that," I said. It came out smooth, easy, nothing in my voice to suggest the war happening underneath it. He thanked me, told me he'd send a car, and when I hung up the phone, I stood there a long moment just breathing, feeling the weight of what I'd just agreed to settle into my chest, like a stone dropping to the bottom of still water. I wasn't doing this because some part of me wanted Eldridge Tatum's attention. I was doing it because Pickens had closed every door, Marquise had closed his ears, and the only person left standing close enough to whatever happened to Theodore was the man holding the door he thought I wanted opened. If he wanted to believe I was softening toward him, I would let him believe it. If he wanted to mistake my presence for interest, I would let that mistake work in my favor. Every dinner, every visit, every hand he rested over mine, I would store it, not feel it. I would watch him the way Theodore must have started watching him in those final weeks. Except I had the advantage Theodore never did. I knew what I was looking for. I went to my closet that evening and picked out a dress I hadn't worn since before Theodore got sick the first time, years ago. Something elegant enough to belong at Eldridge's dinner table without looking eager. I studied myself in the mirror and didn't recognize the calculation in my own eyes. Grief was still there, underneath, but it had stopped running the show. The phone rang again that night. Marquis. You doing okay, Mama? Denise said you seemed off today. I'm fine, baby. Just tired. You're not still going on about the journal, are you? I almost told him. The words sat right there at the back of my throat. I'm having dinner with Eldridge Friday. I'm getting close to him on purpose. I'm going to find out what he did to your father. And for one breath, I wanted my son to know I wasn't losing my mind, that I had a plan, that I was still the woman who raised him. But I thought about his face at the kitchen table, the way he'd looked at his wife instead of answering my question, the door he'd closed on me without even raising his voice. If I told him now, he'd try to stop me. He'd call it dangerous, call it foolish, maybe even call Eldridge himself to warn him something was wrong with his grieving mother. No, I said instead. I'm done with all that. Just trying to move forward. Good, Marquis said, relief flooding his voice. That's all we want for you, Mama. I hung up the phone and sat in the quiet of my living room, alone with what I'd just decided to become, and alone with the knowledge that from here on, I would have to carry it that way. By myself, in silence, with no one left to catch me if I fell. 3 months to the day after Theodore died, I stood in a courthouse hallway in a cream-colored dress, waiting to marry the man I believed had something to do with his death. The 2 months between that dinner invitation and this morning had moved fast. Dinners turning into calls. Calls turning into Eldridge dropping by so often, my neighbors started waving at his car like they recognized it. I'd let him believe every visit chipped away at my grief a little more. I never corrected him. The closer he believed we were becoming, the more careless he grew. He stopped hiding parts of his routine. He talked freely around me. I had already learned more as the woman he hoped to marry than I ever could have, as the widow he was simply trying to impress. By the time he proposed, I understood something I hated admitting to myself. If I wanted the truth badly enough, I couldn't stop at the front door. When he got down on one knee 3 weeks earlier in his too bright dining room, I said yes before I let myself think too hard about the word. Marquis found out the way everyone else did, through family, through whispers, through someone who couldn't wait to be the one who told him first. He showed up at my house the morning of the wedding, still in yesterday's clothes, like he'd driven straight over the second he heard. "Tell me this isn't true," he said, standing in my doorway, breathing hard. "Tell me you are not marrying that man 3 months after burying my father." "Marquis?" 3 months, Mama. His voice cracked on the word. Anger and grief tangled together so tight, I couldn't tell which one was driving him. "Everybody's calling you. Everybody's asking me what's wrong with you. And I didn't have an answer because I don't have one either. I need you to trust me." "Trust you?" He laughed, short and bitter, nothing like my son's laugh at all. "You're marrying Daddy's boss. The man you said was watching you. The man you said scared Daddy enough to write it in a journal. And now you're marrying him? What am I supposed to call that, Mama? If not exactly what it looks like? Marquis, please. You're acting like a whore, he said, and the word landed in my chest harder than anything Pickens or Eldridge had ever done to me, because it came from my own child's mouth, in my own home, 3 months after we buried his father together. I don't even recognize you anymore. He left before I could find words steady enough to follow him, and I stood alone in that doorway a long time, the cream dress suddenly feeling like a costume instead of a choice. The ceremony itself was small, quiet, a handful of Eldridge's associates filling seats that should have held people who actually loved me. I smiled where smiling was expected. I said the words. I let Eldridge slide a ring onto my finger that felt heavier than any vow I'd ever made. And I thought of Theodore's handwriting the entire time. I think he knows I know. And wondered if he'd ever imagined this is where his warning would lead. That night, alone in the guest room I'd claimed for myself before Eldridge could question it, I sat on the edge of the bed with my phone in my lap, my new husband asleep down the hall, my son's voice still ringing in my ears. I opened my phone and scrolled to a folder I'd created weeks ago, hidden 3 menus deep where no one would think to look. The folder was labeled simply Theo. I stared at it for a long moment before I let my thumb hover over it, finally ready to start filling it with everything Eldridge Tatum didn't know I was already collecting. Living in Eldridge Tatum's house taught me how to move like a woman who wasn't looking for anything. I learned his schedule within the first 2 weeks, gone by 7, golf on Saturdays, calls he always took behind the closed door of his study. I learned which days his housekeeper came, which days the house was emptiest, which hours belonged to me and me alone. His study was the one room he never invited me into, which told me everything about where to start. The first time I went in, my heart beat so loud I was sure it would give me away through the walls. I photographed what I could reach without disturbing its place. Folders labeled with warehouse codes, insurance documents, a ledger with numbers that meant nothing to me yet, but might mean something to someone who understood them. I worked fast, careful, putting everything back exactly as I found it, the way I imagined Theodore must have moved once he started suspecting the same things I now knew for certain. It became a rhythm. Photograph, replace, breathe, leave. Days folded into weeks of small, careful theft. And every night I added what I'd gathered into that hidden folder on my phone, building something out of nothing, the same patient way Theodore had filled his journal. Then, on a Thursday morning, I stepped into the study and noticed his laptop had restarted after what looked like an overnight software update. Eldridge rarely bothered locking the computer he kept at home once he was inside the house. It had already signed back into his desktop, and several business programs were still reopening in the background. I shouldn't have touched it. I knew that even as my fingers moved toward the keyboard. One messaging app had reopened automatically and was still syncing recent conversations. A small notification flashed that older archived chats had finished loading onto the desktop. Before the window refreshed, a conversation already sitting near the top of the screen caught my eye. A name sat above the thread, unfamiliar enough that it stopped my breathing for a second. Rosalind Pichon. The messages beneath her name were old, the dates stretching back years, long before Theodore had even started working for Eldridge, as far as I could tell. I only caught fragments before my nerves screamed at me to stop reading and start documenting. Keep this between us. I'll make sure you're taken care of. You don't need to mention what you saw. I didn't know who Rosalind Pichon was. I didn't know what she'd seen, or when, or why it mattered enough for Eldridge to be promising her silence years before my husband ever died. But I knew the shape of that conversation. I'd lived inside that exact shape for the past several weeks of my own life. I photographed the screen as fast as my hands would let me, my pulse hammering in my ears louder than any sound in the house. I didn't dare scroll. I didn't dare open anything else. I captured only what was already visible before closing the window exactly as I'd found it. That's when I heard it. The garage door grinding open 2 hours earlier than his golf game should have ended. I shoved my phone into my pocket and was halfway to the study door when I heard his key turn in the front entrance, his voice calling out, casual and warm, the way it always was right before something in this house went wrong. "Carlene, whose car is that out front?" "It's mine," I called back, steadying my voice before he reached the study. "I had it serviced. They dropped it off early." Eldridge accepted it with a smile and a kiss on my cheek that I let happen, my pulse still hammering long after he'd moved past me into the kitchen. He never checked the laptop. He never asked why I was standing in his study at all. I'd gotten away with it, and that night, I went looking for the only name I had to chase. Rosalind Pichon wasn't hard to find once I had her name spelled correctly. Public property records led me to a small apartment complex 2 towns over. A woman in her 50s answered the door with the cautious look of someone who didn't expect visitors. "I'm not selling anything," I said. "My name is Carlene. My husband worked for Eldridge Tatum. He died at the warehouse 4 months ago." Something moved behind her eyes, fast and frightened. "I think you've got the wrong person." She started to close the door. Before it shut, I quietly took out my phone and opened the photograph I'd taken of Eldridge's old messages. "I found your name," I said, "on his computer." The door stopped moving. For a long second, she stared at the screen, then passed me toward the parking lot, scanning it the way people do when they've spent years expecting bad news to arrive without warning. Finally, she stepped aside. "You shouldn't have come here," she said once the door was closed. "But I'm not surprised someone finally did." She told me she'd worked the night shift at the warehouse years ago, long before Theodore. She'd been the one to find a man on the floor near the loading dock, hours before his official discovery. And what she'd seen hadn't matched what the report later claimed. "The scene wasn't right," she said, her hands twisting in her lap. "Things had been moved. The safety guard that was supposed to be locked into place. It wasn't there when I found him. It was there an hour later when the supervisors finally let anyone call it in." "What happened to him? The man you found?" "He died 3 days later. Internal injuries. They called it an accident. Same as your husband." She looked at me then, steady, like she'd carried this alone long enough that saying it out loud was its own kind of relief. "Eldridge came to me himself, 2 days after. Told me how much he appreciated my discretion. Handed me an envelope before I even said I'd be discreet about anything." "You took it." "I had 2 kids and a mortgage, and the man already had police, lawyers, half the county in his pocket. What was I supposed to do? Fight him with what? My word against a closed case?" Her voice cracked on the last word, old shame rising fresh to the surface. "When I heard about your husband, I told myself it was a coincidence. I told myself that for months." "Was it?" Rosalind shook her head slowly, and the look on her face confirmed something I'd suspected since reading Theodore's last journal entry, something that finally had a shape and a name and a witness willing to say it out loud. "He's done this before," she said. "Theodore wasn't the first." I left Rosalind's apartment with her words still ringing in my chest, and I knew that whatever I'd been doing alone up to that point wasn't enough anymore. I needed people who could turn what I had into something a courtroom would respect. I found Roscoe Dunmore through a friend of a friend, a small office 2 floors above a dry cleaner. Nothing flashy about the man at all except the way he listened. Really listened. without once telling me I was grieving wrong. "Walk me through everything," he said. "From the beginning. Don't leave anything out, even what seems small." I told him about the report, the missing hour, Pickens's phone call I'd overheard, the journal, Rosalind, the necklace, the warning Theodore had written 2 days before he died. Roscoe took notes the entire time, his face giving away nothing until I finished and he sat back in his chair. "This is more than suspicion, Mrs. Whitfield. This is a pattern, if even half of it holds up. But patterns need proof. I'm going to bring in someone who knows how to find it." That someone was Otha Renwick, a private investigator Roscoe had used before, a quiet man who asked fewer questions than Roscoe had, but somehow seemed to already understand most of the answers. I gave him everything. The photographs from Eldridge's study, Rosalind's name and address, the dates from Theodore's journal, the ledger pages I'd copied weeks earlier without knowing what half the numbers meant. "Give me 2 weeks, Otha said. "I can't promise answers, but I can promise I'll find out where the paper trail starts." The 2 weeks that followed were the hardest kind of waiting I'd ever done. Smiling at Eldridge over dinner, letting him rest his hand over mine the way he always did, knowing that somewhere across town, a man I'd hired was quietly pulling apart everything Eldridge believed was buried for good. I felt something steady settle into me during that wait, something that didn't feel like grief or fear anymore. It felt like patience, with teeth. Otha called on a Tuesday evening, his voice carrying none of its usual calm. "I found something you need to see in person." I met him at Roscoe's office an hour later, my heart climbing into my throat the entire drive. Otha spread a series of documents across the desk. Public corporate filings, bank records Roscoe had obtained through lawful legal requests tied to the developing civil investigation, and wire transfer summaries connecting an account registered under another name through 3 shell companies to Eldridge Tatum. "It took a while to untangle," Otha said, pointing to the documents. "The shell companies weren't illegal by themselves. What caught my attention was the timing. Once I had that pattern, Roscoe was able to obtain records that filled in the gaps." He pointed to a string of withdrawals. "This account has been active for almost 8 years. Regular payments, always cash or untraceable transfers, always timed within days of specific dates." He slid a second page toward me. "One of those dates is the week a warehouse worker died 6 years ago. Another is the week after your husband's accident." I stared at the numbers, at the dates lining up exactly the way Rosalind had described, exactly the way Theodore's journal had warned, and felt something cold and certain settle into my bones. "This isn't speculation anymore," Roscoe said quietly, watching my face. "This is a pattern of payments that deserves to be investigated. Combined with Rosalind's testimony and everything else you've uncovered, we finally have enough to take somewhere that matters." Something shifted in Eldridge the following week, subtle at first, the kind of change only a wife paying close attention would catch. He started taking calls outside, away from the house, his voice dropping the moment he saw me near a doorway. He spent longer hours in the study, the door locked now where it had only ever been closed before. One evening, I found him standing at the kitchen counter, staring at his phone, his jaw tight in a way that had nothing to do with me. "Everything all right?" I asked. "Fine," he said, too fast. "Work thing?" "Nothing for you to worry about." I told Otha about the change that same night, and his voice on the phone carried a sharpness I hadn't heard from him before. Someone tipped him off, or he noticed irregular access on his own. Either way, he knows something's moving. "Roscoe reached out to a state investigator I trust this morning," he added. "He's been looking into an older death at Tatum Logistics for months. I don't know if it'll amount to anything yet, but if our evidence overlaps with his case, that's exactly what we've been hoping for." 2 days later, Otha called again, this time with the kind of urgency that made my stomach drop before he even finished his sentence. "We may have a problem." The words hollowed out my chest. "What happened?" "He's deleting things, Carlene. Files from business accounts, transaction records, even moving money between companies. For a few hours, I thought we'd lost part of the trail." I closed my eyes. "So, can he erase all of it?" "No," Otha said, and I heard the tension ease from his voice. "That's the good news. The records Roscoe obtained were preserved before he started cleaning house. What we're watching now isn't the evidence disappearing. It's him reacting to it." He let that settle before continuing. "But here's what you need to understand. A man destroying records, the moment he senses legal scrutiny, isn't proof by itself. What it does show is consciousness of guilt. He's not just covering his tracks. He's confirming he believed there were tracks to cover." I sat with that a long moment after we hung up, watching Eldridge from the hallway as he paced his study with his phone pressed to his ear. His easy charm nowhere in sight now, replaced by something tighter, more frightened than I'd ever seen him. The call that changed everything came 3 days later, while I was sitting in Roscoe's office going over Otha's latest findings. Roscoe's phone rang, and he stepped out to take it, returning a few minutes later with an expression I hadn't seen on him before, something between caution and quiet excitement. "That was Detective Garrison Stallworth," he said. "The state investigator Otha mentioned. He's been working a reopened inquiry into a death at Tatum Logistics from 6 years back. Until now, he had witness statements pointing in one direction, and we had financial records pointing in another. Rosalind's testimony finally connected the two." My breath caught. "He knows about Rosalind?" "He knew her name from the original case file," Roscoe said. "What he didn't have was a witness willing to speak or financial records tying those payments back to Eldridge. We have both." Roscoe dialed Stallworth back and put him on speaker, his voice low and even, through the line. "Mr. Dunmore, I appreciate you calling back so quickly. I've spent months rebuilding that earlier case without enough evidence to move on him. Between your financial records, Ms. Pichon's cooperation, and what my office has already uncovered, I believe we finally have enough to seek a warrant." "Then why hasn't one been filed?" Roscoe asked. "Because a man like Eldridge Tatum doesn't get caught twice the same way. I've got one shot to do this right, and I need to know exactly when he's home, when he's vulnerable, and when moving on him won't give him room to destroy anything that's left." Stallworth paused. "I just need the timing right." Stallworth called Roscoe 2 mornings later with a single line, "Today. Be ready." I went home that morning the same way I had for months, quiet, steady, a wife moving through her house with nothing on her face to betray what was coming. Eldridge had been tense all week, snapping at calls, watching his phone like it might bite him, but that morning he seemed almost calm, like a man convincing himself the worst had already passed. "I've got people coming by later," he mentioned over coffee. "Compliance review, nothing serious. Routine audit stuff from corporate." I didn't correct him. I let him believe whatever story let him sleep that morning, because I already knew what was actually coming, and I knew it wasn't wearing a corporate badge. The doorbell rang just after 11. I was in the kitchen when I heard it, and something in my chest went very still, very focused, the way it had the night I'd first opened that locked drawer. I walked to the door slowly, giving myself the few seconds I needed to settle my face into something unreadable. Through the glass, I saw them. Roscoe Dunmore in his dark suit, Otha Renwick beside him with a folder pressed against his chest, and a third man I'd never met in person, but recognized instantly from the steadiness in his stance, Detective Garrison Stallworth, his badge already out, 3 men standing on the porch in a row, like something out of the nightmares Eldridge had clearly stopped letting himself imagine. Eldridge came up behind me before I opened it, his hand brushing my shoulder. "Who is it?" I opened the door without answering him. Stallworth spoke first, his voice calm, procedural, the voice of a man who'd waited 6 years to use it on this exact doorstep. "Eldridge Tatum? I'm Detective Garrison Stallworth, State Investigations. I have a warrant here regarding the deaths of 2 employees at Tatum Logistics, along with financial records tied to obstruction and witness tampering." I felt Eldridge go rigid beside me, the warmth draining out of him in real time. He'd braced himself for clipboards and spreadsheets, for men in polo shirts asking about safety compliance, not for a badge, a warrant, and the particular stillness of a man who had finally run out of room. "There's clearly been some mistake," he said, and for the first time since I'd met him, his voice cracked at the edges, color leaving his face so fast it looked like something physical had been pulled out of him. He turned to me, searching my face for the comfort he was used to finding there. "Carleen, what is this? Tell them this is ridiculous." I said nothing. I looked at him, really looked, the way I'd been looking at him for months without ever letting him see it. And I thought of Theodore's handwriting, of Rosalind's trembling hands, of every withdrawal Otha had traced back to the man standing beside me, searching my eyes for a rescue that was never coming. Eldridge said my name again, softer, almost pleading. I stepped back from the doorway instead, wordless, and let the 3 men walk past me into the house he'd built on other people's silence. They didn't arrest Eldridge that morning. They didn't need to. Stallworth had built it patient and tight, and 3 days later, the warrant became charges that landed on the news before they ever landed fully on me. Manslaughter, tied to both deaths. Obstruction, witness tampering, fraud, woven through years of payments designed to look like nothing at all. The financial records Otha had pulled, the ones Eldridge had tried so hard to erase in those final frantic days, became the backbone of a case Stallworth said he'd never have closed without them. The deletions hurt him worse than the records would have on their own, Roscoe told me, sitting across from me at his office, the same desk where this had all turned real months ago. Spoliation, they call it. A man destroying evidence the moment he feels someone watching. A jury reads that as guilt, even without a single witness in the room. And Rosalind? She's testifying, scared but willing, now that there's a case strong enough to protect her instead of just asking for her silence. Roscoe slid a folder across the desk toward me. "Which brings us to you. I want to file something on Theodore's behalf, a wrongful death and fraud suit, naming you as his rightful claimant. Eldridge concealed what he did to your husband, destroyed records to keep it buried, and profited from that silence for years. The law has a place for that kind of harm, separate entirely from anything to do with your marriage to him." I sat with that a long moment, Theodore's face rising up behind my eyes the way it did most nights now. Not the version I'd found in that hospital bed, but the version from his journal, careful and frightened, and trying to protect me even as he ran out of time to do it. "Do it," I said. "Whatever it takes to put his name where it belongs in all this." The filing made the local news that same week, my name printed beside Eldridge's in a way that finally told the truth, instead of the rumor everyone had been so eager to believe. I watched the segment alone, in the quiet of the guest room I'd claimed as mine the first night of this marriage, and felt something in my chest loosen for the first time since the day that phone rang. My own phone rang 20 minutes later. Marquise. I almost let it go to voicemail, bracing myself for another version of the conversation we'd had on my wedding morning, his voice sharp with a hurt I hadn't found the right moment to undo. but something in the rhythm of the ringing made me answer instead. "Mama." His voice cracked on the single word, thick with something I hadn't heard from him in months. "Mama, I just saw it on the news. All of it. The other death. The payments. What Rosalind said in that clip they showed." He stopped, breathing hard on the other end. And when he spoke again, it came out barely above a whisper. "You weren't crazy. You weren't grieving wrong. You were right about all of it. And I called you a Mama. I am so sorry." I closed my eyes, the weight of months finally finding somewhere to set itself down. "I know, baby," I said softly. "I know." The courtroom didn't feel the way I expected it to feel. I'd imagined thunder, some dramatic collapse, Eldridge finally breaking the way he'd nearly broken on that doorstep months ago. Instead, it was quiet. Folders sliding across tables, a judge reading from pages in a voice that never once raised. The whole machinery of justice moving slow and certain instead of loud. Nearly 11 months had passed since the morning 3 men stood on my porch. The criminal case had worked its way through hearings, evidence motions, and delays that seemed endless at the time, while Roscoe pursued Theodore's wrongful death claim alongside it. Justice, I learned, wasn't fast. It was patient. Roscoe stood and laid it out plainly. The concealment, the years of payments meant to silence 2 deaths. The records destroyed the moment Eldridge sensed he was being watched. Rosalind testified, with a steadiness that surprised even me, her voice only shaking once, when she described the safety guard that hadn't been where it should have been. Otha's financial trail spoke for itself, line after line, date after date, until there was nothing left for Eldridge's attorneys to argue except smaller and smaller technicalities the court ultimately rejected. The wrongful death and fraud suit succeeded. The court awarded me a substantial settlement, drawn directly from the concealed assets Eldridge had spent years hiding behind shell accounts and hush payments, money that had been used to bury silence now repurposed to acknowledge a truth 2 families had waited years to hear spoken out loud. It came separate from anything tied to our marriage, exactly as Roscoe had promised it would. Theodore's name finally placed where it had always belonged, at the center of it. Eldridge didn't look at me when the judgment was read. He stared straight ahead, the same stillness on his face that had replaced his charm the day 3 men stood on my porch. And I felt nothing when I looked at him. Not triumph, not anger, just the quiet absence of a man who'd spent years believing his money made him untouchable. After the civil judgment became final, I filed for divorce, a formality at that point, a single thread left to cut after everything else had already unraveled around him. Marquis showed up at my door on a Sunday afternoon 2 weeks later, holding nothing in his hands this time, no flowers, no excuses prepared, just himself, standing where Eldridge had once stood with lilies, except this time I wanted exactly who was in front of me. "I keep thinking about what I said to you," he started, his voice low. "The day of the wedding. I called you something I have no right to ever call my mother, no matter how angry or scared I was. You were carrying all of this alone, trying to get justice for Daddy, and I made it harder instead of standing beside you. You believed what made sense at the time," I said. "I let you believe it, because telling you the truth would have put you in danger too. I should have trusted you anyway." He stepped forward and pulled me into a hug that felt like the first solid ground I'd stood on in over a year. "I'm proud of you, Mama. I don't know how you carried all that without breaking." "I almost did," I admitted against his shoulder. "More than once." After he left, I sat on my porch as the evening settled gold and quiet over the street, thinking about every voice that had doubted me along the way. Marquise at that kitchen table, Pickens in that small office, Eldridge believing right up until the very end that I was exactly who he wanted me to be. They'd called me foolish for marrying him. Now they call me free.